Okay, I'm going to attempt to tie it all together for you. And to do that, I'm going to step back a very long way and basically ask the question, why does this stuff work? So we've seen some evidence, we've seen the stuff that I gave you the intro, you've seen Tim Saltz, you've seen Chris Beers, looking at their profiles, looking at some improved outcomes associated with as a consequence of, etc. So I just want to take a big step back and say, so why does that happen? Because it doesn't happen by magic. So I want to go right back to 60 years of research on human motivation and do that in 2 minutes. Right? It's quite straightforward because it's obvious. Really, there's no great rocket science here. If you want to understand motivation, ask yourself this question. When you go home at the end of the day and say, that was a fantastic day, ask yourself what happened. Reflect. And it'll be something along these lines. So the first, not necessarily in this order, the thing that we know, again, solid research since the mid-1950s, is that fundamental to human motivation is the sense that my effort can make a difference, that I can fight town hall, that I can make changes, that I can influence what goes on around me. The second is that I do something meaningful, that I have a sense of purpose around what I do. I'm not just doing this, I'm doing that. And you'll notice with both of the CEO speakers, they talked about the relationship their organisation has with the community and the sort of initiatives that they're doing that technically, in the short term, have absolutely nothing to do with their business. But their longer term impact is quite enormous. So they think outside of themselves. Where can we do something beyond what we are doing? The third is I'm learning something new. So in that great day, you would have gone home and said, well, that was a real challenge. I didn't quite know how to do that. Now I know how to do that. I wasn't sure I had the confidence to do that. All these kinds of things. The next is I'm supported by those around me. So you know when you go home on a bad day, it's because you're all on your own, nobody to share it with, nobody to talk about, nobody to understand. You would have liked to have had a shoulder to cry on, euphemistically kind of thing, or you go home and kick the cat instead. Right? Followed by I enjoy what I do. So there you have 60 years of research on human motivation in probably less than 2 minutes. So we need to ask ourselves, what are we doing as an organisation? What am I doing as an individual manager to help people see that my effort can make a difference, I'm doing something meaningful, I'm learning something new, I'm supported by those around me, and I enjoy what I do. The guys out the back who do our audio for us, particularly Dan, who you saw come on as the business process guy, always give me a hard time because I often refer to death. And the reality is the older you get, the closer you get to it, right? So I'm going to do it for these guys out there because they said you haven't mentioned death yet. You're a bloody long time dead. They also said you haven't sworn yet. You are a long time dead. And so you should enjoy what you're doing because you never know what the hell's going to happen to you tomorrow. And so do we live our lives like that? Are we alive in the moment? Are we accepting that everybody else has given us a huge compliment by coming to work today? And so what are we doing to return that compliment? So just think about those 5 factors. If we can do that, we are going to have motivated people. So the next question now, does motivation make a difference and what's its relationship with culture? So we took a data set, I selected randomly 750 Australian organisations out of our data set, Australian and New Zealand organisations, and created a formula, very simple to do, to say let's rank them from the most constructive to the most defensive cultures. So the most constructive to the least constructive, if you like. So at the top, I can't remember whether I did 10 or 25%, doesn't matter, but the most constructive cultures in the data set look like that, and the most defensive look like that. Then we take one of the outcomes of culture measure called motivation. So we can, in our surveys, we can measure motivation level. Most constructive, least constructive. So mathematically, there's a 55% difference in motivation levels between those two cultures. So just to go back, if you have a culture that approximates a constructive culture versus a culture that approximates a defensive culture, you are likely to have a 55% higher motivation level. And we know, again, the 60 years of research says that if people are motivated, they will go that extra mile, they'll help out, they won't say it's not my job, They'll be advocates of your business to clients, customers, friends, and all that kind of stuff. So the next step is to say, okay, the leadership stuff. Where does the leadership stuff link in? This was, again, I selected 400 individual leadership profiles from the Australian New Zealand data set, and again, ranked them from the most constructive to the least constructive. Again, most constructive to most offensive. And in those instruments, we also ask for feedback about how effective is this person in doing their job. That's task effectiveness. In terms of working with other people, that's interpersonal effectiveness. And then if you average the two of them, you get overall effectiveness. So you can see, in rough speaking, there's something like 27% difference in effectiveness between, again, just to go back so you can see the picture, between a constructive manager and a defensive manager. Now, 27% is a lot statistically. It might not sound a lot, but a lot of this is around the edges. I mean, I can't remember which tennis tournament, well, it wasn't the latest one, it might have been Wimbledon. And Wally Masseur, a player that I had enormous respect for, a brilliant player, was commenting. And this guy was losing 6-2, 6-3, 6-love kind of stuff. And he used a very interesting comment. He said, he just has to increase his play by about 3% and he'd be winning. Because if you play tennis, it's a very cruel game. You can just lose those 10 critical points and all of a sudden you've lost a set 6-love, right? Which makes it sound as if you've been absolutely walked over. So it's the increment edges that make the difference. I want to move into, I used the phrase consciousness when I talked after Tim Salt's presentation. And again, you've seen with Chris Beer, the importance of reflection, the importance in thinking about what the impact is I use. So in one case, Tim Salt's used our styles measure, the lifestyles inventory. So that's his personal styles. On the other hand, Chris Beer, through TAP, has used one of our other instruments called Leadership Impact, which looks at what leaders do and how well they do it, and what impact are they having on the people that they are leading. And so it's now saying this is the culture that you as a leader are developing within this group of people who are giving you feedback. So each of those different orientations or different ways of looking at personal feedback has a lot to do with the level of consciousness in the individual and therefore the collective consciousness within the organisation. So 2 years ago we developed a model based on work by Professor Dexter Dunphy around his model of transformational change. And we introduced it last year. We built 2 years ago. I built on it. We introduced some more stuff around last year. And I kept saying, and we will keep building on this. And this is now build number 2, third iteration of it. For those of you that haven't seen the original, I'm going to go through that very, very quickly, just so you get a sense. This thing has 2 axes. So the bottom to top axis is a defensive to a constructive culture. And the horizontal axis is from no belief in the importance of leadership through to very high commitment. So you can create 4 quadrants, etc., etc., etc. And as the bottom line indicates, as you move up the boxes, across the boxes, you move from vulnerability to potential. Okay? So what we did was we looked at the data that we had. Corinne Cantor and Dr. Tricia Stratford, who presented at last year's conference, they're out there somewhere in the bright lights, put this together based on a framework and based on the data that we had. So the first group, if you like, we called the denial stage. So let me step back from this for a moment. Why did we do this? We have certain organisations, you've now seen 2 more, that are doing an outstanding job, that they are working on and have transformed their culture and their leadership. The one that we've used most commonly over the years and has been incredibly generous with its time to go and speak with clients is Lion. Was Lion Nathan, now simply Lion with the amalgamation with National Foods. So to put that in context, what we get is we get an organisation who says, look, we're starting on this journey and we want somebody who's been there, done that to come and talk to us. So with their sheer generosity of time, somebody from Lion will go and talk to that client, potential client, and say this is what we're doing. And then a year or 2 later, we will get some feedback saying, well, we tried that and it didn't work. First lesson is there is no one size fits all. There is no simple answer. Otherwise, we wouldn't have all the consultants that are here in the room today helping organisations. It's what's called in the textbook requisite variety, just to show you I do know what I'm talking about. It's various and it's required, it's requisite. So what works for you may not necessarily work for you. But one of the important things that we found is that what happens, just to continue with that analogy, is this organisation who's actually down here in stages of consciousness talks to this organisation which is actually up here in stages of consciousness and does what they do, but this organisation's not ready to do that yet. So it doesn't work. So actually, if you're talking to an excellent organisation, don't ask them what they're doing now, would be my simplistic advice around this, is ask them what they did 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, depending upon where they are. So for instance, if you're talking to Lion, ask them what they did 15 years ago, not what they did this year, because it might be very different. So we created this to help assist with that. Where are you in the journey is the obvious question. So the first stage is what we call the denial stage. We took a data set, that's why I brought my notes out here, because I never, despite the fact that I use numbers all the time, I forget. 750 organisations, Australia, New Zealand, again, selected reasonably randomly to make sure it's fair, and 11% of the organisations fell within that category. And this is how you might describe that denial stage. Both words and pictures. Again, I don't need to read the words out. Then you see the short-term horizon thing coming in there. And that's what their average culture profile looks like. The second stage is the non-responsive stage. So now you actually get the bulk of the organisation. 40% of that data set sit at that level. And again, we describe that as indifference, lip service, etc. And I just love that photograph. Going that extra mile. The next phase, 17% of organisations, we call the compliance stage. So this is now where organisations tend to see things as right and wrong, good and bad. Right? Now, I'm just going to take this opportunity to say there's actually nothing good and bad about this stuff. It's either what's helping you or what's hindering you. Right? So even right down to your own personal feedback, it's not bad that you have got a whole lot of red. It doesn't make you a bad person. It just means making it much harder for yourself. So what you think you're trying to do, you're probably not achieving. So by focusing on your daughter's 1/6 not great result, you're denying her excitement and joy over the 5/6 great result kind of thing. Didn't mean to do that. Right? So, but they do tend to get into that, and it's a nice to have, and it's very measurement focused, etc. Then we move through to 11% of organisations sit in what we call the efficiency phase. This is where organisations are now beginning to see the relationship between cause and effect. That the culture is about improving current efficiency. So this is current efficiency, trying to do what we currently do better, as opposed to, perhaps for want of a consultant phrase, a whole new paradigm. But you see how the time horizon's shifting a little now. Through to the strategic proactivity phase, where 18% of the organisations sit there. And this phase, again, the metaphor of the conductor, disparate capabilities that you bring together to create a whole. And then the final stage, the sixth, is only 3% of organisations sustaining, resilient stage. And again, I thought a good metaphor was sailing. If any of you are sailors, you know you cannot control the wind, you can only control what you do with the wind. Okay? Go New Zealand in the America's Cup at the moment. Okay? So it's just what we do, it's proactive, short-term, long-term, medium-term horizon, much more community, multiple stakeholders, whatever you want to call it, balanced scorecard, that kind of stuff. Right? So that's where we got to a couple of years ago. We developed the model, developed the theory, had a good, based good theory, started to apply some data, started to form some conclusions. Playing around with that data even more over the last 12 months. First thing we learned is it's not linear. It's actually a number of plateaus. Okay? So there's like the first two stages, where, for one of and I can't think of a better one, it's like trying to get your feet out of the mud. You know, you're stuck there and you really can't get anywhere until you get out of that mud. But once you do, you're up and running. But you do hit another plateau at those middle two phases, and then you'll hit another plateau. So I'm saying this because your organisation is measured and not shifted over the last 12, 24 months, then it may be it's plateaued. So we now need to think about what do we do from there. So part of our building on analysis has been, so how do you move through within this that's now 3 phases, because that's 2 stages at each of those phases, but then how do you do the big jump from phase to phase? And it's going to go something like this. So we combine those first 2 stages into this first phase, calling it the reactive stage. And it's defined as these. These, again, are consistently the characteristics of the organisations that sit. And remember, this includes 40% of the organisations in the data set. So it's half the data set in round figures. Rather slow and late, reactive. That's why we called it reactive. Right? And the reality of life today, whether it's governmental, local body, not-for-profit, or commercial, is that change is all around us, as the song goes, right? It's constant, it's getting quicker. Technology is driving quicker changes. So we have to learn to become adaptive. But these organisations, by their very essence, are reactive rather than proactive. And again, I attended a session that was run by Peter Fuda with one of his clients talking at an evening get-together, and McCarthy, the real estate guy, he used a great expression. He didn't know where it came from. I've Googled it and can't find it. But I thought it's the line that stuck with me. If you don't like change, you're going to like extinction even less. Think about it. Not a bad line. So movement within these two stages within reactive. So the movement from the first stage to the second stage within this phase is around building meaning and content. So what do we do first? And so we've looked at the organisations that have transitioned. What have they focused on? We've looked at the total data set and seen what's the difference in the causal factors that we measure as part of our surveys to say they moved from there to here. And you're doing a lot of things. And assuming, or the assumption underlying all of this, is that you're doing a lot of work on your leadership. So what I'm largely going to talk about is organisational systems. And the leaders are enablers of the organisational systems. So we might have an organisational system that encourages involvement, but if I, as your manager, say, just sit down, shut up and do your job, the system's not working too well, right? So, building shared meaning and a sense of inclusion, for want of an overall. So specifically around the mission and philosophy. So you heard both Tim and Chris talk about their vision, their mission, their philosophy. A very good question to ask an executive team is, what's your philosophy of management? Right? Just think about it. Our actions are based on our thoughts. Our thoughts are based on our beliefs. That's what I mean by philosophy. So these really strong organisations have well embedded in them a philosophy of what life in this organisation means for you. It might be called an employee value proposition because we need fancy names for them or something like that, but that's what I'm talking about. Employee involvement. No more powerful way of creating change than involving people in that process. Right? There's no more fundamental form of respect to an individual than to ask them for their opinion on something. So let's structure the organisation in such a way that people have the opportunity to get involved, and let's make sure that our managers are well trained to let go of control, as Chris said, in order to get control over time. Autonomy at the job level, you've all read about and some of you may have written about the importance of autonomy at the job level. That means at the individual job level, I get to make some choices about how and when and what I do in terms of my job. Because if I'm doing a job that does not require any autonomy, it's very difficult for me to see that my effort makes a difference. I just do this. It's very difficult for me to learn new things because I just do this. Right? And this is the importance of what we call these organisational structures and systems. So I'll give you autonomy and how we inadvertently create defensive cultures. We don't do it on purpose. Nobody wants one on purpose. Is that we might have all the statements, we might even have mission and philosophy statements about inclusion and empowerment and involvement and taking responsibility and using your initiative and all those kinds of phrases that we tend to use out there. The reality is that if I'm sitting at my desk doing a job that has absolutely no autonomy, when you tell me to use my initiative, put a bubble above my head that essentially says, you have to be freaking kidding me. My job doesn't require any initiative. So you're wasting your time. You're just making yourself look stupid as an organisation. Right? So the structures and systems have to match what you're saying. and what the rhetoric is to use that word. So autonomy and goal emphasis is role modelling by people in leadership positions. So if this is what we're, because mission and philosophy isn't just a fancy word about we want to change the world one organisation at a time kind of stuff. It's what do we do about that? How do we communicate that? How do we make that important to each of our staff members? What's the priorities in this organisation right now in order to achieve that objective? And so now the question is, do your leaders role model those priorities? So if one of the priorities is client engagement, you don't want leaders talking about clients being a pain in the proverbial kind of thing, right? So it's alignment, to use a word that you may well have heard in Chris Bear's presentation. So getting your feet from in the mud to on the mud, to summarise it, is about building meaning and context for people. So think of the context and meaning stuff that was both Tim and Chris's addresses. Very, very powerful stuff. And we've got 3 baseline measures so you can see some data as we go. First measure is level of motivation in those organisations. Second is organisational level quality as reported by the people in those organisations, and how externally adaptable is the organisation. So we see that these reactive stage organisations score at that level there. The next phase, transformation 1, from those first 2 to the next 2, is moving from meaning to motivation. So building a focus on top of the meaning and context to very clearly allow people to see how their effort can make a difference. And so organisations in this group are defined as matches environment, it's much more planned change, and they've got constructive stuff there. There's a fair bit of blue, but there's also a fair bit of green and red. But there's significantly more blue and less green and red than in the bottom profile. So what have those organisations done to move from that first phase to the second phase? Again, they've done a lot of things. This is by purposely try to oversimplify things, and life is never that simple. But the predominant patterns that emerged are around individual motivation elements. So how do we motivate and demotivate people? First is we punish. Second is we reward. Right? Now every organisation has reward and punishment systems. The reward may or may not be money. The reward may be simply, well done, fantastic job, did it well. I once remember working with a police organisation that will remain unnamed, but their philosophy on reward was say, well, at least you didn't get shot. What more do you want? We're tough around here. That's rubbish. Gee, I nearly swore again. How do you punish people? You criticise them in public, you exclude them from things, you have in-groups and out-groups, you give other people favourite jobs because you like that person, so this person's now being punished. How do you reward people? You give them a pat on the back, you say, well done, you may pay them something more if you can and all that kind of stuff. Depends on your remuneration structure and the industry, government, etc. that you're in. Very powerful. What happens in most organisations, in those bottom organisations, is the mantra will be, you never get any praise for doing a good job around here, but you sure as find out when you screw up. Think about that. Is that your organisation? Right? Whereas what we want is you consistently get praise around here, and yes, you get feedback when something hasn't gone quite so well. Right? So did Tim Salt, dare I pick on poor old Tim on, it's a very good example because it's inadvertent. Did he mean to find fault, or did he mean to praise? What she saw, what he intended, not necessarily the same thing. And more respect for members, which is around equity, or what we typically call diversity. So people are treated with respect, whether they're male, female, in between, black, white, pink, yellow, blah, 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 blah. It simply doesn't matter, right? Does it matter that 2 of the people in the staff are on maternity leave right now, 2 more are about to go on maternity leave, etc., etc.? No, it doesn't. They do a good job while they're there, they contribute, they stay a sense of belonging, and somebody comes in on a contract position and contributes, and we keep moving forward. Respect for the individual. One of the most demotivating things that can happen to you is when something happens that is unfair. When you say that wasn't fair, I will guarantee you, from a scientific perspective, what you're saying is, I am so damned unmotivated right now, it isn't funny. So we need to make sure that it is fair, and that's where we talk about rewards, punishment, fairness of appraisals. Now, fairness is a word that people Fairness is a word that people shy away from. It sounds touchy-feely. It's not, right? Because one of the most unfair things that can happen is for you to be performance judged on something that you can't influence. So you now feel out of control. You don't feel that your effort makes a difference. You are now unmotivated. But all too often, through our effort to try and make objective something that is very difficult to make objective, we actually hold people accountable for measures that they cannot influence. And this is more subtle than it sounds. I've just checked the watch, so I've got time to tell you a story. I may have told this story somewhere in the past with some of you, I don't know. This is an experience I had a long time ago, probably 20 years ago, working with a supermarket chain in the United States. I happened to be there at the time, they took me along, and I was only there for a couple of days. But I'll put it in dialogue form to you. This company was trying to grow its profitability. It was the 1980s, and so post-oil crisis, economic climate, etc., we need to do something to increase productivity, whatever it might be. And so they had a traditional consulting firm come in and do a performance remuneration system for them and all this kind of stuff, and it wasn't working. Right? So they decided to incentivise everybody, etc., and you go down a very difficult road when you start to do that kind of stuff, right? But it's complex. So here's the conversation, right? I'm talking to a store manager, and I'm saying, given all of this stuff, what is your goal? And he trots out the company response. It's to improve revenue and profitability, blah, 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 blah. Rubbish. What's your goal? And I basically just keep being a proverbial until I get this person to admit, I want a big bonus. Because now we've found out where the rubber hits the road, right? Of course you want a big bonus. If you've got 50% incentivised remuneration, you want to get it. Nothing wrong with that, it's human nature. The question is, should we be doing that? And I'm not against incentivised remuneration systems, by the way, it's just that they are extremely difficult to actually make work. And this one wasn't, this is how. So I said to the store manager, what are you measured on? And he said, I'm measured on revenue growth and profitability. But the strongest part of the formula is on revenue growth. Okay, we all focus on revenue growth. So how do you increase revenue in this business? And he says, well, I mean, you have full-page, two-page spreads in the dailies, so you're advertising. And you look after that? No, that's done by national marketing. Interesting. We're going to create an equation here. To increase your bonus, you increase your revenue. To increase your revenue, you advertise, but you don't look after that stuff? Nope. Okay, interesting. How else do you increase sales? You have lost leaders. Toothpaste at 57 cents a tube or something. And you look after that? No, that's a national distribution agreement with supplier. Okay, so to increase your bonus, you increase your revenue. To increase your revenue, you have lost leaders and you don't look after that stuff? Nope. And I'm not going to bore you with the rest of it. You just keep doing this until he feels about that tall. Because with many retail businesses, it's very centralised decision making, as it needs to be. Again, don't get caught up in the decentralisation, centralisation debate. It's requisite variety. For some organisations, it's essential. For some organisations, it's a very poor decision. Right? So you've now got a store manager 6 foot tall, feeling about 2 inches tall. Right? Where do you go from here? So tell me, what do you control? Big sigh of relief. Well, I control shrinkage rate. Stuff walking out the door, unaccounted for. And the national staff shrinkage rate in that business from memory was something like 28%. It's like 28 or 38, I can never remember which, we'll go with 28. So if you're not familiar with that term, it's product unaccounted for, mostly stolen by your staff. Right? So 68% of shrinkage is stolen, and 65% of it is staff related. Right? So go into a supermarket and just visualise 30% round figure of all this stuff disappearing. And of course, it comes straight off your bottom line, comes straight off your profit. Here is your store profit minus shrink rate equals not a lot. Right? You can control that? Hell yeah. Right? Staff overtime, you can control that? Yep. Floor utilisation, you can control that? Yep. Utility costs, you can control that? Yep. Etc., etc., etc. So we put together a very simple formula and said, look, if you're going to incentivise, by all means do it, but incentivise it on the basis of what the manager can actually control. So incentivise on the basis of reduction of shrinkage rate, etc., etc., etc. And that one suggestion, the company claimed 12 months later, earned them $52 million more profit. Just think about that. You've now got people being measured on the basis of what they can control and influence. And now, my effort can make a difference. So fairness of appraisals does not mean lovey-dovey stuff. It means I'm actually appraised on what I can influence. Training and development, you never want to hear, how the hell did she get to go on that course? It should be very clear how she got, why she got to go on that course. And better person job fit. Never confuse constructive with nice. Since we deal predominantly with aggressive defensive organisations, it's very easy for them to reframe the constructive stuff as, tree hugging and camp mother and all this kind of bullshit that I've heard for 40 years. There is no relationship between constructive and nice. Because one of the things you want to do to develop a constructive culture is if you have a person who's not performing very well, is you want to do something about that. If you have somebody who's in the wrong job, you probably want to get them out of that job. So person-job fit becomes very important. And you will look at companies like Lion, who have done substantial transformation throughout a number of years, and they will talk about how we transitioned this person out of the business. We said to this person, your future, well, it's great here now, but there's no promotion possibilities for you, so your future will be somewhere else. And that's great. You'll take what you've learned from us with you, etc., etc., etc. Okay? It's not nice, it's constructive. There's a big difference. And so the focus is to create personal motivation. Okay? And here's, for one of this benchmarking stuff, here's the scores for the organisations on motivation, quality and external adaptability at that phase. So the third major transformation step is now around sustainability. So moving from motivation to sustainable performance, collective contribution. And now you've got a very different concept happening here. And the key word is integration. So it's leading, it's proactive, it's satisfaction oriented, so the stuff's primarily in the top half of the circumplex now, the blue, satisfaction oriented. We've involved people, we've given them a sense of meaning and purpose, we've created systems that encourage personal motivation and individual motivation, and we're now creating integration of all of that. And one of the key elements of that integration is for the organisation to see itself as part of the wider community, as you've listened to with the likes of Tim and Chris, and as you've heard with Lion speak in the past about the things that they do in terms of environmental context, etc. So it's around integrating structures, systems and individual leaders, and this is the important, this is a very simple phrase, but this is very, very powerful, seeing a clear relationship between cause and effect in terms of individual, group and organisational issues. So I'll give you an illustration of what I mean by that. A year, 6 months ago, a very good recruiting firm in town called The Next Step asked Bob Barber from Lion and I to come and attend one of their breakfast sessions and do a sort of an answer thing with their clients. One of the people in the room said to Bob Barber, who's the head of HR for Lion, said, I'm actually in the same building as you guys, and as I go up the lift to our floor, you've got really, really funky offices. So has that been a major contributor to your constructive culture? Do you know what Bob's answer was? He said it has absolutely nothing to do with it, because it doesn't. There's no research anywhere to suggest that the funky... He said actually it's about saving money. We couldn't afford to put too many walls up and give everybody their own space and all this kind of stuff. That's being very honest, right? And also, another person said, with your very constructive culture, do you find now that you have great equity, equality, diversity, all of that kind of stuff going on? He said, actually, it's not an outcome of culture, it's a causal factor of culture. It's a cause and effect. We get things the right way around. So at that level, the people are as good as the research, if not better, than somebody like me. They read it, they know it, they understand, they know what causes what, they know the relationship between cause and effect. And as you can see, the culture is beginning to look rather quite constructive. And here's the performance indicators for those organisations. Now, as an aside, an interesting piece of information that came out of the data is for those organisations in those first two stages, so the first phase, the reactive stage as we began to call it, when they move from the first to the second step, within that reactive stage, they've got to put in a whole lot more input than they will get as output. So if you do a survey and you do some change and you do another survey, whatever the survey is, what this says is you like to say, we tried so hard but we didn't get much of a result. That's pretty typical. It's telling us. You've got to put in a whole lot more effort than you're going to get at outcome. And the other interesting thing, fascinating thing about the outcome part of it was the outcomes were at the group and organisational level, not at the individual level. So people did not say they are more motivated, they are more, this is within this stage, not between the stages. Within this first two stages that make the reactive stage, they weren't saying they're more motivated, they're more satisfied, they're more committed or anything like that, but they are saying we work together better in our team. We communicate better across teams within the organisation. We are doing better quality as an organisation in my part and the organisation as a whole. We are becoming more adaptable to our external environment. So, interestingly, the outcomes were not around engagement type things, which is an individual measure. They were around departmental or group and organisational measures. When you move now into the motivation, so because we've created meaning, that's why we get that group and organisational stuff. But as we move from the meaning to the motivation, now, and that's measured here, you get that very big gap between the red one and the green one. You've now got a very big shift, but you also get incremental shifts, and in some cases quite big shifts, in the departmental and organisational level stuff. So the lesson for us from there was that if you're making cultural change, again, we're either using us or anything, and you're looking at individual-based feedback tools like engagement scores, don't be surprised if you feel that, you put all this effort in and we got like a 2% increase or something. That actually would appear to be reasonably typical. Stick with it. Right? That's the hard part. Then the Sigmund curve, you're sort of doing very well and then you start to decline, so you do some changes and you decline a bit more, but then you push the curve up. It's in that phase there that takes the courage, whatever that might be. It might be revenue because you're changing things very dramatically. It might be certain internal measures or whatever. Okay? So what have we learnt from all of that? Because I spend my days looking at the spreadsheets from hell, which I absolutely love. First thing, we need to look at the whole system. There's two elements to this model. One is the elements of the system, the other are the products that we have that are aligned to each of those elements. So I put the products in here because the accredited practitioners that are out there can not only see the model, but can see how it fits with what we're doing with what they're doing. So we want to take a whole system integrated approach to change. So the first thing we need to be cognizant of that we know impacts on organisational effectiveness is societal values. Right? So the values that are deemed to be important in a society. And we say that that is measured by our organisational culture inventory ideal, the preferred OCI. That one that had all that constructive stuff when I showed the average Australian data way back at the very beginning. Because those constructive styles are consistent globally with societal values. Certain societies have other societal values that may not be constructive, but every culture has the constructive ones. So if you look at 11, it's about striving. Do what you do well. Right? Try to do it better. 12 o'clock self-actualising is try and learn and grow. Discover some stuff. 1 o'clock humanistic encouraging is around help those that are less advantaged than you. Hold out a hand. And the affiliative stuff is around relationships. No man is an island kind of thing. You need people around you to help you. Those values in one way or another are consistent right across the world. And we're not the only one to say that. The Robert House study, for instance, says that. So we need to be cognizant in our development of an integrated model for business, for organisations, as are we reflective of societal values? Because if we are not reflective of societal values, we have an issue. Somehow, somewhere, something will trap us. That then leads to the behavioural norms and expectations in the organisation. So in theory, our organisational culture should be reflective of the societal culture, but as you saw in that data, it doesn't seem to be. That's because a number of things now happen. So we need to factor into the integration model the organisation's culture. And then the way members behave, we happen to call it members' personal style. And that's measured, the culture thing is obviously the OCI, the culture inventory, which you've heard people talk about. And the LSI now kicks in, the one that Tim Salt was talking about, is the personal styles. I got a lot of red, I got a lot of blue, I'm high in this, I'm low in this, etc. So you can see a relationship between societal values filtering down into organisational culture, impacting on how individuals behave, and there are effectiveness outcomes that can be measured. through each of those. So that's the nice, simple, that's the one that everybody knows, but it's a little bit more complex than that. So sitting out to this side is what we call the leader's strategies and impact. So the things that leaders do and how they do it, and the impact that they have on the organisation's culture. That's the leadership impact and the management impact tools, which is what Chris Bear talked about. And out this side, we have the organisational systems, structures, technologies, how the organisation takes input and turn them into outputs, basically, because each of those two things in their own way impact on organisational culture and members' personal styles. So if you're looking for a way of seeing the integrated elements, particularly if you're an accredited practitioner, and wasn't there yesterday when I mentioned this, is you'll see sometimes you'll be debriefing or coaching a manager, let's just use LSI as an example, and that manager might have a rather passive defensive profile, a lot of green, to keep it simple. And you'll be trying to coaching this person about, taking responsibility, using their initiative, having more confidence in themselves, etc. And then they say, yeah, but you really should be talking to my manager. Boy, I want to see his profile, right? That's a systems thing. I'm limited to my passive defensive style because I have a manager above me who made me believe that that's probably the safest way for me to survive. Right? Or the system encourages that kind of stuff. Sitting out to this side, you have the subsystems, the subgroups. So the group styles inventory, for those that know that one. So that impacts on all of this stuff as well, as does, it's a bit of a technical term, but it's what's called boundary spanning activities. In the organisational development literature, boundary spanning activities are how the organisation bumps up against its boundaries. So how do you deal with your customers? How do you deal with your suppliers? How do you deal with your investors? How do you deal with the media? How do you influence the environment, etc., 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 okay? And so we need to understand all of those. So again, if I use Lion as an illustration, you talk to Bob, he can talk to you about the influence of societal values, he can talk to you about their culture and how that influences how members behave. He can talk about what they do as leaders and how well they do it and the impact that that has on people's behaviour in terms of culture and personal styles. He can talk about the structures, systems and technologies in the organisation and how that impacts. He can talk about what we do at the group level, how we bump up against our customers, suppliers, etc., and how all of that combines to influence our effectiveness. Okay? So two objectives with that. One, for those that don't know us, is to see the elements of the system. For those that do know, is to see where the products link into that. That's the only advertisement for the morning. So the second thing is understand where you are on the journey. Take a good, honest, frank look at yourself and say, are we denial? Are we non-responsive? Are we compliance? Are we efficiency? Are we strategic proactivity? Or are we sustaining resilience? And be honest with yourself. And of course, you've seen the profiles that we've attached to these stages based on our analysis. So you look at your profile, if you have one, as an organisation, its culture, and see where you stand on that. And of course, individuals, as I talked about last year with the leadership impact data, individuals have varying stages of consciousness as well. The third thing is to understand where to focus your efforts, the so-called requisite variety. Okay? These are elements from our How Culture Works model that highlight the 5, where 1 is core, 5 plus 1, groups of levers for change, drivers of culture. I don't like the word drive, you might have got that in my introduction presentation. The causal factors that become the levers for change. So the first one is mission, philosophy, strategy, priorities, etc. So our vision is, our purpose is, our mission is, our strategies are, our priorities are, and they are well communicated. So you, in theory, can take somebody from the bottom rungs of the organisation and say, so what's the purpose? What's the vision? What's the mission? What's the key strategies and what's being prioritised for this year? And they can tell you that, and they can. And we're talking blue-collar workforce in some instances, right? Because it's not only there, it's extraordinarily well articulated. And when things are well articulated, they are well understood. The organisation structures, not the wire diagram. I've been chief executives for 40 years have said, oh, this is our organisational structure. And my standard response is, I don't really care. I'm going to find out how it works, not what it looks like. That's what makes the difference. So how does your structure work? What's the interconnectedness in that structure? What's the communication between teams in that structure, between departments in that structure? How centralised, decentralised should it be in your industry? What does the research tell us about that? So therefore, are you aligned with what that research is saying? Should you centralise more? Should you decentralise more? Okay. I had a story come into my head about structure, but it's gone just as quickly. It doesn't matter. The key thing around the structure is, given those 5 elements of motivation, does it allow people to see that their effort can make a difference? Does it allow people to, etc., etc., etc.? So therefore, how do we do that? We do that through involvement, we do that through influence, we do it through empowerment. So those are the 3 things. Do people have involvement, empowerment and influence over the way things get done inside the organisation? The third is the HR systems, right? And so basically the HR systems give signals to people about what is important here. Right? So, I mean, one of the very commonly used performance management, performance evaluation system is what's called in the textbooks forced choice ranking system. So basically a manager is told, look, you've got 20 staff to review, you're only allowed 2 5s and 5 4s and all this kind of stuff. The biggest nonsense in the history of organisational management. And that, by the way, is a research-based statement. Because what message does that give to people? Fundamentally it says, it's not so much how well I perform, it's how well I compare. So you are now like Tim Salt at Pepsi with a bullet aiming for the back of your head. Goal number 1, make sure somebody else collects your bullet. Then you're going to get a 5 or a 4. It's crazy, right? So that's what we mean. So you will do lots of LSIs and you might do some leadership impacts and all these sort of individual 360 feedback tools or whatever the hell it is that you're using, and you'll find competitive style. So you're running this wonderful leadership development program to try and talk people into reducing their competitive style, and they basically may not have the honesty to say to you, actually it's what's encouraged around here. So it's all very, I agree I shouldn't behave like that, but here you have to. So I will, which is why Tim Salt had that model that I created for our very first conference 15 years ago. Funny enough, I was looking at the presentation yesterday out of curiosity. The leadership, culture, performance connection. The leadership culture is, it's a simplified systems diagram, whereas that earlier one that I just showed is not simplified. Leadership and culture, that you need to focus at both levels. The research says that if you focus only at leadership development without doing cultural activity, you will minimise your returns. As a consequence, you'll get goal returns at the personal level, but you may not get returns at the organisational level. Job design, that autonomy stuff, variety and all that kind of stuff. So how jobs are designed, because people take messages about how they are expected to behave from the job design. And internal communications, how you communicate upwards, downwards, what you communicate, what you talk about, what seems to be important, what are the priorities. Okay, one of your values is this, but your management people talk about that, so which one is it kind of stuff. If you can focus on those things and remember the requisite variety, that's why I use that rather technical term, what's going to work for your organisation may not necessarily work for your organisation, which is why we're interested in data and collecting data and seeing what might well work for you. Remembering, so the 4th thing and what we learn is keep in mind the 5 fundamentals of human motivation. If we can do that, we can keep challenging ourselves and reflecting, does this allow people to, right? So, as a bit of a close, let me introduce a very, very good book. If you like reading books on management, read these 2. They are outstanding books. The first one is called Firms of Endearment, and the second one is called Conscious Capital. And this data is about the Firms of Endearment data, but written up in Conscious Capital, so I quote both books there, because the Firms of Endearment was published in 2007, so their economic data only went that far. Conscious Capitalism took that through to, when was it, 2013, and so we're able to add more years to it. One of the problems with our industry, and it's a very serious problem, is many of the books go like this. They choose successful companies, and they say, okay, so what did you do to make yourself successful? It makes for a fantastic book, but are they right? Is that actually what made them successful, or do they just think that that's what made them successful, etc.? Very few good research studies have done what this book has done. Okay? And they've done it the other way around. They started off with a list of 3,000 organisations. They created a definition of what they called a firm of endearment. And one of the criteria of firms of endearment was that it had a humanistic culture, which is a word that we use. So a firm of endearment is a firm that people love working with, investors like owning, customers love buying from, suppliers say they're really fantastic to deal with as a customer, and all this kind of stuff. Endearment firm, right? Now, interestingly, one of those firms that made the final cut to 30 organisations is a company called Whole Foods in America, which is by any measure a very good company. And the lead author on Conscious Capital, Mackie, is actually the chief executive of Whole Foods. He got so excited by the research project that he decided to write another book around that stuff. And because he's a very good CEO, he's got time to write books because he's delegated everything. So what these folks did was they started off with 3,000 firms, created these definitions of what they were looking for until they ended up with, I think from memory, it was 30 organisations that made the cut, as they said. And then they said, now, wonder how these organisations are performing. So they weren't concerned with performance, they were concerned with the culture of the organisation. And the end result of their performance analysis goes something like this. So on an annualised basis, for the left-hand graph being the firms of endearment, the right-hand graph being the S&P 500 in the US, you can see they outperformed the S&P market. And if you're a shareholder, investor like me, basically your fundamental goal is to outperform the market. Right? So if the index is going to go up by 10%, you want your share to go up by 11 at least. Right? So you can see they outperformed over the 5-year, 10 years and 15 years. And the reason the Conscious Capital folks redid this was they said Firms of Endearment was published before the GFC. So we're going to add the GFC years onto their data set to see, okay, these companies have done very well when everybody's doing pretty well, but how did they do when it all went to the proverbial during the GFC? And you can see, over the 5 years, the last 5 years, that's the GFC, the 10 years before that, and 15 years in total. And when you accumulate that, you see those sorts of results. So to put some numbers around that, over a 5-year period, they outperformed the market by 3.7 times, 8.3 times over 10 years, and 10.5 times over the 15-year horizon. It's an excellent study because they began with what's going on in the organisation, set some criteria, nailed it down to 1% of the original data set, actually 0.1% of the original data set, 30 organisations, and then said, so how are these companies performing? And as you can see, they are performing extremely well. So is there a relationship between culture and performance? Frankly, it's a no-brainer. It really is. When we've known this for a very, very long time, we still get organisations at that non-responsive and denial phase saying, oh, I'm not convinced about all this people management stuff. For God's sake, get into the 19th century, if not the 20th century then, right? Because it's there. The data is there for you to see. If you haven't seen these books, read them. They are both outstanding books. And the Conscious Capital, by the way, is the whole stakeholder thing around. It is about, I mean, as this guy says, head of Whole Foods, it is about making money, but it's not just about making money. It's about being conscious of the footprint that you leave behind you.